On the morning of January 14th, 2025, Greg Biffle woke up with plans. Plans for the day, plans for the week, plans for the future. He was a NASCAR champion, a beloved figure in motorsports, a man who had spent his entire life mastering the art of speed and risk management. He understood danger intimately. He had faced it at 200 miles per hour countless times and emerged victorious. But that morning, as he prepared to board a Cessna Citation for what should have been a routine flight, he had no way of knowing that a single mechanical failure, lasting just seconds, would change everything, would end everything. One engine failure, 2 to 3 seconds of catastrophic mechanical destruction, and 3 lives extinguished. This is the story of how one moment, one failure, one decision changed Greg Biffle's life forever by ending it. Greg Biffle wasn't just a passenger on this flight. He was part of the crew in a sense. He held a multi-engine pilot rating. He had invested significant time and money into his aviation training because flying wasn't just transportation for him, it was a passion. Like many successful people in high-stakes professions, he was drawn to aviation for the same reasons he was drawn to racing: the precision, the skill, the mastery of complex machines, the freedom. He owned this Citation, this beautiful business jet that represented both achievement and capability. It was his airplane, his investment, his pride. He was flying that day with Dennis Dutton, a 67-year-old retired Delta Airlines captain with decades of professional flying experience. Dennis wasn't just qualified, he was the epitome of aviation professionalism. Thousands of hours in jets, years of airline operations, the kind of pilot you'd want in the left seat if something went wrong. And also on board was Dennis's son, Jack, a 21-year-old college student studying professional aviation at Auburn University. Jack was building his own flying career, working toward the same kind of professional credentials his father held. This was likely a mentoring flight, a father passing knowledge to his son, with Greg along as the aircraft owner and student pilot. It should have been routine. Statesville Regional Airport to wherever they were headed. A short hop, maybe a training flight, maybe a personal trip, the kind of flight that happens thousands of times a day across the country without incident. The weather wasn't perfect, ceilings around 1,200 feet broken, visibility 5 miles in drizzle, but it was legal VFR within the limits for visual flight. The aircraft was properly maintained, the pilots were qualified, everything was by the book. The Citation lifted off runway 10 at approximately 10:05 a.m. local time. The takeoff was normal. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, rotated at the appropriate speed, lifted into the air. Gear came up, flaps retracted. The aircraft began its initial climb, engines producing full takeoff thrust, everything operating exactly as designed. For perhaps 60 to 90 seconds, it was just another flight, just another departure. Nothing to suggest that in less than 10 minutes, all 3 people aboard would be dead. Then, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 feet, something catastrophic happened. Based on post-crash evidence, particularly photographs showing the missing right-hand nose baggage door and severe damage to the right engine's fan blades, the most likely scenario is this. The right nose baggage compartment door came open. Whether it hadn't been properly latched before flight, whether it had been partially latched but not fully secured, whether vibration worked it loose, we may never know for certain. But it opened, and when it opened at over 150 knots with tremendous airflow and pressure differential, items inside that compartment were violently expelled. And here's where aircraft design and bad luck intersected with fatal consequences. The position of that baggage door forward of and slightly below the right engine intake meant that anything coming out of that compartment had a high probability of being swept directly into the engine. It's almost as if the geometry was designed for this exact failure mode. Though of course it wasn't designed, it was just an unfortunate alignment of components, items from the baggage compartment, luggage, bags, whatever had been stored there, were ingested into the right engine. And when a jet engine ingests foreign objects, when solid debris enters an engine designed only for air, the destruction is catastrophic and instantaneous. The fan blades at the front of the engine, spinning at thousands of RPM, struck the foreign objects. Despite being made of titanium alloy, despite being incredibly strong, the blades couldn't withstand the impact. They bent, they cracked, they shattered. Within 2 seconds, so the engine went from producing 2,500 pounds of thrust to producing zero thrust and massive drag. The cockpit erupted in warnings, master warning lights, engine fire warnings, possibly, oral alarms, but more immediate than any warning light was the physical sensation. The aircraft yawed violently to the right as the asymmetric thrust tried to rotate the aircraft. The pilot, almost certainly Dennis Dutton, given his experience and qualifications, would have immediately stomped on the left rudder pedal to counteract that yaw, fighting to keep the aircraft under control. And in that moment, in those first few seconds after the failure, Greg Biffle's life changed forever. Not because the outcome was already determined, not because survival was impossible, but because a clock had started ticking. A clock measuring the time remaining until a series of decisions and circumstances would make recovery impossible. The engine failure itself didn't kill Greg Biffle. What killed him was what came after. The decisions made under pressure, the circumstances that reduced margins to nothing, the convergence of multiple factors that individually would have been survivable but together were fatal. Let me walk you through what likely happened in that cockpit, the human experience of this emergency, because understanding the human element is critical to understanding why one engine failure changed everything. Dennis Dutton recognized immediately that they'd lost the right engine. The yaw, the warnings, the instrument indications, all of it screamed engine failure. His training, his experience, decades of professional flying, and all of it would have kicked in automatically. Maintain control, maintain airspeed, keep the aircraft flying. But Dennis was almost certainly also experiencing something else. Uncertainty, because this wasn't just a simple engine failure. There had been a loud bang, possibly multiple bangs. There was possibly unusual noise or vibration from the baggage door being open. There might have been visual cues, items flying past windows, unusual airflow effects. Dennis would have known something bad had happened, but he might not have immediately known the full extent. Was it just the engine, or was there other damage? Was the situation stable or deteriorating? Was there fire? Was there structural damage? That uncertainty, that incomplete information creates enormous psychological pressure to land immediately. You don't know whether the aircraft is going to stay together, whether you might lose the other engine, whether the situation might get worse. Every instinct screams at you to get on the ground now. The airport is right there behind you, maybe 2 miles away. You just took off from there. You know the runway. It's familiar. It's safe. Turning around and landing seems like the obvious choice, the conservative choice, the choice that gets you back on solid ground in the next 2 or 3 minutes before anything else can go wrong. And for Greg Biffle, sitting in that cabin, possibly in the right seat if he was receiving instruction, possibly in a passenger seat, experiencing the violence of the engine failure, the yaw, the warnings, the sudden transition from normal flight to emergency, his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The champion who had faced danger at 200 miles per hour on racetracks was now facing a different kind of danger, one where he wasn't in control, one where his skills, his experience in racing, his understanding of speed and risk, none of it directly applied. He was a passenger in his own aircraft, dependent on the pilots to get him home safely. The decision was made, probably within the first 30 seconds after the failure, to return to Statesville immediately. We know this from the flight track data, which shows the aircraft climbing initially to approximately 2,000 feet, then leveling off and beginning to maneuver back toward the airport. 2,000 feet. That's not much altitude. That's maybe 2 minutes before you're on the ground, if you're descending at a normal rate. That's barely enough time to complete a 180-degree turn and line up with a runway. And the weather that day made everything harder. Ceilings at 1,200 feet meant they were probably flying in and out of clouds or right below clouds. Visibility of 5 miles in drizzle meant visual references were degraded. Finding the airport, getting visual contact with the runway, judging altitude and distance, all of it was harder than it would have been in clear weather. They needed to descend to get below the clouds to see the runway, but descending meant using up precious altitude they might need to make it back. We have evidence of what happened next from actual audio recorded from the aircraft. A radio transmission made by Jack Dutton was captured by people on the ground at the airport. Listen to this. Took off runway 10. We've got an issue here. We're getting everything going. We're getting our gear down. We're getting our gear down. They're extending landing gear. They're configuring for landing. And the implication from the context, from the fact that Jack is making position reports and announcing what they're doing, is that this is happening while they're still maneuvering, still trying to get lined up, still working to find the runway in the poor visibility. This is early configuration. And in a citation operating on one engine at high weight, early configuration is a commitment you can't reverse. The moment that landing gear extended, Greg Biffle's fate was sealed. Not because the gear caused the crash directly, but because the gear committed the aircraft's energy state. The citation cannot maintain altitude with gear down and flaps extended on one engine at maximum weight. It's not a matter of pilot skill or technique, it's physics. The drag from the extended gear and flaps exceeds the thrust available from one engine. Once you're in that configuration, you're descending. The only question is whether you have enough altitude to make it to the runway before you run out of sky. They didn't have enough altitude. The flight track shows them maneuvering in the area of the airport, apparently trying different approaches, possibly trying to line up with different runways as they struggled to get visual contact in the poor weather. Each turn, each maneuver, each second spent not aligned with a runway was altitude being spent, energy being consumed. And with the gear down, with the flaps extended, the descent rate was inexorable. They were going down whether they wanted to or not. The final approach was toward runway 28. They were lined up, or nearly lined up. They were tracking toward the runway, but they were low, too low. They impacted the ground 1,800 feet short of the runway threshold. 1,800 feet. At a normal approach speed, that's about 10 seconds of flight time. Greg Biffle died 10 seconds away from the runway, 10 seconds away from survival, but those 10 seconds required altitude they'd already spent, altitude consumed by the decision to turn back immediately instead of climbing away first. Altitude consumed by maneuvering at low altitude trying to find the runway in poor weather. Altitude consumed by configuring early instead of delaying until certain they could make it. The engine failure started the emergency, but it was the cumulative effect of those decisions made under pressure and uncertainty that determined the outcome. And I want you to understand something about how Greg Biffle died. It probably wasn't instantaneous impact and lights out. In the seconds before impact, as the aircraft descended through the final 100 feet, as trees or terrain rushed up to meet them, everyone in that cockpit knew what was about to happen. They knew they weren't going to make it. They knew impact was seconds away. They had time to understand, to realize, to experience the terror of knowing death was imminent and unavoidable. Greg Biffle, champion driver, aviation enthusiast, beloved figure in NASCAR, spent the last moments of his life experiencing that terror. The recognition that this was the end, that despite everything, despite all the skill and all the effort, they weren't going to make it. That's how one engine failure changed his life forever. By ending it, yes, but also by filling those final moments with the worst kind of knowledge, the certainty of impending death. The impact destroyed the aircraft. Fire erupted immediately. All 3 occupants died on impact or in the immediate aftermath. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but there was nothing they could do. The fuselage was torn apart. The fire had consumed much of the wreckage. The lives that had been vibrant and full of potential just 10 minutes earlier were gone. For Greg Biffle's family, for his friends, for his fans, for everyone who knew him, the engine failure changed their lives too. Changed them by creating a hole, an absence, a grief that will never fully heal. Greg was 54 years old. He should have had decades ahead of him, decades of life, of experiences, of relationships, of contributions. All of that was taken in 10 minutes by one engine failure and the cascade of circumstances it set in motion. For Dennis Dutton's family, the loss was compounded, not just a father, but also a son. Dennis and Jack, 2 generations lost together. A father who had spent his career flying safely, who had logged thousands of hours without incident, dying in an accident in what should have been a routine flight. And Jack, just 21 years old at the beginning of his life and career, gone before he'd had a chance to fully realize his potential. The investigation will eventually determine the exact sequence of events. The NTSB will publish their findings, will identify contributing factors, will make safety recommendations. But for those who loved these 3 men, the technical details don't bring them back. Don't fill the void. Don't ease the pain. And here's what makes this tragedy so frustrating, so infuriating to those of us who study aviation safety. This was survivable. Engine failures on twin-engine aircraft are serious emergencies, yes, but they're survivable emergencies. They're trained for. There are procedures. Other crews have faced the same failure in the same aircraft type and survived. The difference between survival and death in these scenarios comes down to the decisions made in the first few minutes after the failure. If the crew had climbed to altitude instead of turning back immediately, if they had delayed configuration until certain they could make the runway, if they had diverted to a larger airport with longer runways, Greg Biffle might be alive today. Dennis and Jack might be alive. The aircraft might have been repairable. The story might have had a completely different ending, but those choices weren't made for understandable reasons, for human reasons, under stress and uncertainty, and the result was 3 deaths, 1 engine failure, 2 to 3 seconds of mechanical destruction, and everything changed forever. Not just for Greg Biffle, but for everyone whose life he touched. For the NASCAR community that lost a champion, for the Dutton family that lost a father and son, for everyone who loved these men. The lesson, if we can find meaning in tragedy, is that margins matter, that decisions made under pressure determine outcomes, that following established procedures, even when instinct screams to do something else, saves lives, that training and practice and mental preparation for emergencies are not luxuries but necessities, that one mechanical failure, one moment of bad luck can change everything if we're not prepared for it. Greg Biffle's life was defined by speed, by competition, by excellence. He was a champion who understood risk and managed it successfully for decades. But on that January morning, he faced a risk he couldn't control in a domain where his expertise didn't apply. Dependent on decisions made by others, and one engine failure changed his life forever by ending it far too soon. If you're a pilot watching this, honor Greg Biffle's memory by learning from this tragedy. Train for engine failures, practice the procedures, overcome the instinct to turn back immediately, climb first, get altitude, give yourself options. Don't let one engine failure change your life the way it changed Greg's. If you're not a pilot, if you're here from the NASCAR community grieving the loss of a legend, know that his death was not in vain if we learn from it. If this tragedy prevents future accidents, if it motivates pilots to train harder and follow procedures more carefully, then some small meaning can emerge from the loss. Subscribe to this channel to stay informed as more details emerge from the investigation. Share this video with others who loved Greg Biffle and want to understand what happened. And never forget that life can change in an instant, that we should cherish every moment, that tomorrow is never guaranteed. Greg Biffle, NASCAR champion, aviation enthusiast, beloved friend to many, changed forever by one engine failure, gone but never forgotten. May he rest in peace.